Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Daniel, and today in this video we'll be covering my round 3 game in the Eastern Action. This is an online tournament, and in this tournament my rating was 1737. I was playing white, and let's take a look at what happened in this position. So this was a relatively long game. It was a Grunfeld defense. I had tried out. At this point, it was a new variation I had learned. I had learned it for a couple of months at that point, and this was my first time in a tournament game that I was able to play it. So that led to a bishop endgame, where we actually pretty recently traded off the bishops. So right here in this position, I actually managed to win this pass pawn here on b3, and then we ended up in this position right here. So it's a 5-on-4. I have 5 pawns versus my opponent's 4 pawns. However, their king is getting in on e4. So here I had calculated that after king to d4, king to d5, I calculated after king to c3, if king to e4, my opponent actually loses. The reason why my opponent loses is that after king to e4, I don't play king to d2. This would be a draw because there's king to f3, and then my opponent would be able to get to the h pawn. Instead, I go up. I play king to c4. So now that after king takes e3, I have king to c5. So now I can get behind my opponent's pawns. And I had calculated that I was able to take this pawn, the f5 pawn, right before my opponent was able to get to these pawns. So the variation I calculated was, let's say, king to... sorry, it's black's move. Like variation I calculated was that here, if my opponent, I believe, played king to e4 to stay close to this pawn, I will play king to d6, king takes d4, king takes, and then here I believe the variation was king to e3, if king to f6, king to f2, king to g7, king to g2, king takes, king takes, king takes, king takes, king takes on f5, yes. And now I have the extra f4 pawn. The black king is behind the pawn, which makes it even easier. Here, let's say king to h4, and I can simply play king to g6 even. Outflank the king so the king can go to h5, and then simply just push the pawn. So I calculated that I would be able to win. I would still have the f4 pawn at the end of that variation. However, here, due to low time, that was the only variation I calculated, and my opponent was actually able to trick me into a draw. King to c5. Here my opponent plays h5. I continue with my plan of king to d6, king takes pawn, king takes, king to e4, king to f6, h4, king takes g6, which is actually a blunder. What I should have done here was play king to g5, ignoring this pawn, because this pawn's more important. Because after king takes on g6, my opponent plays the move h3. And now I realize my opponent's idea. King to f3, king to g2, and king takes h2, and then allow this pawn to run. So I realized at this point that I kind of blundered the position away. I knew I probably should have played something else. King to g5 is actually better because on h3 then I can simply hunt the pawn down. And then once I take this, I have the 3-on-2. And then I can come back to h4, come back to g5, h4, takes this pawn, and then push these pawns to queens. Instead, in the game, as I mentioned, king takes, h3, king to g5. I calculated this variation, and this variation still gave me some winning chances. We push our pawns. And then here, I have a queen. My opponent has a queen, but I have the extra pawn. So, theoretically, this has some winning chances for me, considering we both have low time. My opponent could blunder this position. So how I would win this position was I would try to get a queen trade and make sure my king still has opposition. So opposition, basically I want my king to be here. So basically a hypothetical scenario of this would be, say we trade queens to demonstrate. Opposition would be, so these are just random moves to demonstrate. Opposition would be something like this, let's say. So this would be, opposition for me would be if I have my, let's say king here, king here. So this would be actually opposition because my king's actually in front of the pawn. So I can play king to e6, for example, and then outflank my opponent. However, as I showed a bit earlier here, so let's say here, 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 here. Now black has opposition, and my king's actually behind the pawn, so I can't actually be able to push this pawn forwards because my opponent would always be able to blockade it. I had to make sure that in order to win this position, I had to make sure to avoid a queen trade. Here, queen to a2 I played, king to e3. So now I'm just checking, trying to get some type of a check where I can kind of fork the king and the queen. King f2, continuing the checks. At this point, it's actually a draw. In fact, in this position, yeah, it's a complete draw. My opponent's king just keeps running, and here actually I managed to catch my opponent blunder. So queen to e4, my idea is maybe I can move my king and deliver a check and then put this pawn somehow. Here my opponent plays queen to h4, which is actually a blunder. Now, the reason why this is a blunder is because, well, obviously at this point I want to just give checks. I have really low time, so that's the only thing I'm looking for. The king checks aren't too good because I realize I'm kind of just blocking my queen. So that's not too good. The only check that doesn't involve the king is queen to b7 check. This is actually the winning move. Here, king to h8. I'm weasel closer. And here I realized that I was going to win. After king to g7, queen to g6 check. And here my opponent has to trade queens. It's forced. King to f8, king to h8. Same thing, queen to f6 check. We trade queens, and now I have opposition, and I simply win the game. So, at the very end, a really nice win, considering the fact that I had to really analyze the position and understand it thoroughly in order to make sure that I knew how to win the position. So, yep, thanks guys, and hope you enjoyed the video.